Okay, so this video is the second video in the series of tax videos, and what we're starting to look at now is how do we, in imposing a tax, how do we graph it, what are the implications. So this video is strictly going to deal with a producer tax graph. Again, it's based off of the variant reading that was assigned. So again, we have the same basic supply and demand graph for medical marijuana. I'm asking you to draw the supply curve that shows the producer paying a quantity tax of $50, and then talking about how to compare the old supply curve with the new supply curve. Once with the new tax, what's the equilibrium price and quantity, consumer and producer surplus, tax revenue, and discuss the deadweight loss. So I'm going to walk you through this and explain things as we're going along. So the first thing is we want to draw the supply curve that shows the producer paying a quantity tax of $50. So obviously we're going to be, because we're talking about the producer, we're going to be talking about the supply curve. And remember, the supply curve is the same thing as a marginal cost curve. That marginal cost curve is telling us how much will it cost in terms of additional resources to produce that next unit of output. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to do. So what the marginal cost curve is showing is the actual resource cost. Okay, so the key thing is, if we're saying that there's going to be a tax imposed of $50 and that the producer is responsible for paying that tax to the government, then somehow this supply curve has to be adjusted to reflect that additional $50 for every unit. And so in terms of drawing that graph, all we really have to do is essentially shift up that supply curve by $50. So the easiest thing to do is, since the supply curve goes to the origin, the first point is 50, and let's see how to do this kind of easily. Again, this will be a rough estimation. So what we have essentially is a parallel shift up or to the left, however you want to characterize it. And we have this new supply curve. So the issue is, it's not really a supply curve per se in terms of showing off the marginal cost. In a way, you could see it as at any particular level of output, right, at that vertical slice, we have this issue of the marginal cost, and then we also have this issue of whatever is being produced, they also have to make sure to collect $50 for each unit produced, and that's what this gap is. So in a way, what we're doing is we're saying we've got the supply curve, and then we're tacking on an extra fee of $50 per unit. Okay, so that's looking at showing the supply curve. Now the thing is, this is the so what we have to do is, we're still in figuring out what the equilibrium quantity is. We have to look at now what's happening on the demand curve. Well, nothing is changing on the demand curve in terms of the marginal willingness to pay, how people are feeling. So there's still, the consumers are still reflecting, okay, everything in that demand curve is the same as it was before. But if we look at that original equilibrium quantity, yes, the firm has this marginal cost at whatever that value was, but the problem is, those are the resource costs, and then they have to pay this additional fee to the government. So they actually have to get money to pay the government. And so in certain respects, what the firm is offering the good at is based on this, let's say, marginal cost plus that tax. Okay, so what becomes relevant for planning is this shifted marginal cost curve, or marginal cost plus tax. And so now what we have is a new equilibrium. Okay, so we have this, the new equilibrium is based on the intersection of the marginal willingness to pay, the demand curve, and this new marginal cost plus tax. So this is the equilibrium price that that consumers are paying. So it's about let's just say it's 270, right? But out of that 270, a certain portion is the tax. And then the rest covers that marginal cost of production for that particular level of output. So what we're doing here is we've got this little tweak in terms of, because money has to be collected to pass on to the government, that tax has to be collected, we've got this kind of wedge here between what consumers are paying, still based on their marginal willingness to pay. Their behaviors are not the same, but there's a wedge between what consumers are paying and what producers are getting back to cover their costs, right? And that wedge is the tax. So what we have is, so again, I've explained in words how to compare the old supply curve with the new supply curve. It's reflecting this tax. It's a parallel shift. We've got a lower equilibrium quantity because of that shift of the supply curve. And again, so I want to make sure this is not one of the traditional shifts in terms of those 6 supply shifters. We're talking about a special tax situation which is causing the shift. So we have this new equilibrium quantity, and we have a higher equilibrium, well, I'm not even sure if you want to call it an equilibrium price, but we have a higher price that consumers are paying, and then a lower marginal cost, because producers are producing less, a lower marginal cost that producers are paying, and then you've got this tax gap. Okay? So again, I've just kind of explained how the imposition of a tax, when it's paid by producers, shifts the supply curve, generates a new equilibrium quantity, generates a new price for consumers, a lower marginal cost for producers, and we also see that the tax is taken care of. Okay, so we've taken care of that equilibrium price and quantity. Now let's look at what the consumer and producer surplus is. So again, we have to to do the consumer surplus, we have to look at what is the producer paying. So we're talking about that price of about 270 and comparing that to the actual marginal willingness to pay. So again, we've gone over a number of times what the consumer surplus is. We just have to make sure we're using the right price. So it's this triangle, the area between the marginal willingness to pay, the demand curve, and the price paid by consumers. So that's the consumer surplus. And then we have the producer surplus. Again, it's the price received by producers. So again, because of this tax issue, there's a divergence between the price paid by consumers and the price received by producers. So anyway, so it's the price received by producers is about 200. And it has to be above the original marginal cost curve. Okay, so again, we're not using that shifted curve. We're using the original marginal cost curve, and that is our producer surplus. So there's lots of little tweaks in here that you have to watch out for. Okay. So then the next thing is, what's the tax revenue? Well, the tax revenue is this block of, this is our tax, right? This is the quantity of goods. So this square, we'll just make it all cross-hatching there. That little block there represents the tax revenue generated. Okay? So based on the quantity that we're dealing with, we've kind of allocated all that area between the demand curve and the supply curve. We've broken it up into consumer surplus, CS, here let's do this another, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the tax. Okay, last question is, what's the deadweight loss? So the deadweight loss is this idea of what's the foregone benefits. So because we have this idea in general, if we kind of disregard the tax, we would say, okay, if we could produce a little bit more, could we generate additional benefits? And the answer is yes. This triangle right here represents the deadweight loss, the foregone benefits by not producing at the equilibrium. So we'll just treat that as kind of a definition thing. I don't want to emphasize the deadweight loss too much because it's just hard to do easily and succinctly on a video. Okay, so that's pretty much the issues there. So let's move on to the next slide just to see a cleaner version of the graph. Okay, here we have it. So again, you see this $50 shift. We see the okay, so we see the shift up, and that's the $50. We see a new equilibrium quantity. We see the price, so it's about $250, price paid by consumers, and that $200 is the price paid by producers, or price received by producers. So that gives us the consumer surplus here. We get the producer surplus here, and we get the tax revenue right there. And again, that little triangle is our deadweight loss. Okay, so on the next video we're going to look at the consumer tax graph and see and follow the same process.